Hey guys, this is Lauren from Writer Reader Debater, and I am here with my quarterly wrap-up. This will cover the months of January, February, and March, and all of the books I have read in those 3 months. So let's go ahead and get started. The first book I read was The Madman's Daughter by Megan Shepherd. This is the first book in a trilogy, and I believe the last one came out either at the very beginning of this year or the end of last year, and it's essentially a retelling of The Island of Dr. Moreau. So it has that like gothic thriller, science-y horror feel to it. And I thought that it was pretty well written, and the story was very intriguing, but I only gave it 3 stars. And the reason this is because it gave me major cancer. Now, cancer is the term my friends and I use to describe when you get a really negative kind of icky feeling inside when you read a book or watch a movie, and it's negative and there's no really purpose or intent to it. It's just kind of there and it makes you feel icky. And this book gave me major cancer. Now, it took me a really long time to finish this book, and I considered stopping several times, which I rarely do with a book. I ended up reading it in about 14 days, but I was on break, so it should have only taken me 2 or 3 days, but I just could not read it. It could just not have been my cup of tea, but I actually skimmed through half the book. So it took me 14 days to read a book that I just skimmed through. I couldn't enjoy any of the characters or any of the writing because I just couldn't deal with the story. And maybe it's because I can't deal with horror, maybe it's because I can't deal with sciencey stuff, but the whole idea is that her father has been accused of vivisections, which is essentially dissecting live animals while they're awake, any sedative stuff. They're just alive and in pain, and anyway, I just couldn't handle it. I don't know, if that's your thing, then read it, that'd be great, but I just couldn't get into it. The next book I read was The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. Now, I actually read this book for school, but I'm including it in this video because 1, it was a book I read this year, and 2, I'd been planning to read it anyway. If you've never heard of The Communist Manifesto, it is just essentially the Karl Marx lays out the ideas and the founding principles of communism, and it's a really, really interesting political theory book, and it's very influential throughout the history of the world. So I thought it was really interesting. I gave it 3.5 stars. I don't agree with the philosophy, but it was a very interesting read. It was very well written. The arguments were very well laid out and argued. I still completely disagree with them, and I don't think it was enough to convince me that communism is necessarily a good thing or that his ideas were right or correct. But it was really good to read from his point of view and kind of see the communist mindset. I thought that was just really interesting and a really good thing, and I'm really glad that I got to read this book because it was super interesting. And in the end, I feel like I'm a well-rounded individual, which any book that makes me feel like a well-rounded individual deserves some applause, even if I disagree with the main principles and theories behind the book. The next book I read was also for the same class, and it was The Law by Frederick Bastiat. Now, I gave this book 5 stars. I think that it has to be one of the best political philosophy books I have ever read. I think that everyone, whether you agree with the thoughts or not, should read this book. It is so fundamental to a lot of the founding principles of not only the United States, but many other countries. Kind of frames the political mindset of a lot of political groups and parties within the Western world. And I think it's just like the Communist Manifesto. It's a really good idea to read both of them because then you get a really well-rounded view on the idea and the view of government and what government should be. And it's just, it was amazing. I probably quoted it like 600 times already, and I read this in like January, end of January, and it was just amazing. There's so many good thoughts, so many good ideas in here. So the next 3 books are the first 3 books in the Lunar Chronicles series, Cinder, Scarlet, and Cress by Marissa Meyer. And I've actually already read Cinder and Scarlet. So these were rereads. And then Cress just came out in paperback recently, so I bought that and read it. And if you don't know, these are essentially futuristic retellings of fairy tales, and they're all one story, but they're distinct stories within themselves. So there's one major overarching plot, and then there's subplots that are really important to the story. And so Cinder is a kind of a retelling of Cinderella, and Cinderella, the character Cinderella, Cinder, is a cyborg. And then in Scarlet, it's a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, and Cress is a retelling of Rapunzel. And Rapunzel is actually a computer hacker, and it's so interesting. It feels very sci-fi, fantasy. Like, they're just amazing. The writing is really well done. She balances multiple points of views and multiple characters very well. There's a very good love story for each of the characters, which I absolutely love. I love that aspect of it. There aren't really any love triangles, which is great, very refreshing, but it's also action-packed. So there's a lot of stuff for everyone. I love fairy tale retellings. I love action-packed fantasy sci-fi type things, and it's just all around amazing writing. I gave Cinder 4 stars and then Scarlet and Cress 5 stars. I also read Anna Karenina, and this is a book by Leo Tolstoy, a Russian author. This is kind of a classic Russian book. Now, this book is over 900 pages long, and it took me about 2 months to read it. I read it for a class, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Guys, this book was amazing. It was so good. I think that the title Anna Karenina is very misleading. This isn't just a book about her story and her tragic love story. There's also so much more behind it, and I think that if you really want to understand Russian history during that time, what Russia was like during that time, you have to read this book, because it examined the social structure of Russia at the time, politics, art, food, culture, everything. I mean, it examined pretty much every aspect of Russian life. It was so spectacular. And if you are daunted by the size or the fact that it's written by a Russian author, don't be. Please, please, please pick up this book, because it is so amazing. The names are a little hard to get into and a little hard to keep track of when you first start. But if you just, try to keep them straight in your head, maybe have a chart of characters to help you get through that, it really is an amazing, amazing story. The next book I read in my quest to kind of expand my reading. This year I am reading, for every contemporary book that I read, I am reading either a classic or a nonfiction. So this is part of that kind of self-challenge. And it is called Lost in Tibet, The Untold Story of 5 American Airmen, a Doomed Plane, and the Will to Survive, by Richard Starks and Miriam Murcutt. So this book is essentially about these 5 American pilots who were caught in a violent storm and blown off their course, and they crash land in Tibet. And essentially what they were doing, this takes place during World War II, and they were flying something called the Hump, which is a supply route over the Himalayas. And it's super dangerous, but it's the only way that they can kind of get supplies to China, because China is surrounded and it's horrible. I gave this book 3 stars. I think that it could have been really good, but my main problem with it is that, one, it's only 240 pages, and probably a third of those 240 pages were spent telling unnecessary backstory. And it wasn't just like, oh yes, it's a history book, so there's going to be backstory. No, this was like completely unnecessary, semi-quasi related to the story that literally gave me no understanding of what was going on. It was a super slow read, and the story was intriguing about these 5 airmen who were trying to survive in Tibet during World War II. That was super interesting, but and the writing wasn't very good, and anyway, I was super disappointed with this book, but I got it free on my Nook, so, I mean, I can't be too disappointed because it was free. The next book I actually listened to, because I was in a pretty big reading slump, and so listening to books actually helps me, so I've found out. And that was, as you can probably see on your screen, Panic by Lauren Oliver. Now, I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars, and this book is about Heather and Dodge, who participate in this game called Panic. And essentially, Panic is for all of the graduating seniors the summer after they graduate from high school, and it's this game where you can't panic. So there's all these events, like crossing a highway blindfolded and breaking into someone's house and stealing stuff, but the catch is this guy is like insane and he'll shoot you on sight, and he has dogs that will maul you. and spending the night in a haunted house that eventually catches on fire. And it's essentially like you could die from this game. But at the very end, there's this huge cash prize that the winner of Panic gets. And so both Heather and Dodge are competing in Panic. Dodge is actually competing for revenge for his sister. His sister competed in Panic, and she got to the joust, which is like the final round. And something horrible happened, and there was a big accident, and she became crippled. And Dodge obviously believes it wasn't an accident, so he's trying to get revenge on the family of the people who did that to his sister. And then Heather didn't actually think to compete in Panic. She just kind of did it because her boyfriend broke up with her. It was kind of a really stupid reason to do it, but you know, and she continues to play it because it's a way for her and her sister to get out of her abusive mom's house. And her mom is this big drug addict, and she's always drunk, and she's a horrible person, a horrible human being. Almost everyone in this book comes from a really poor and horrible background. Carp is a very poor place. And I thought that this was really interesting. There's one plot twist that was very accurately foreshadowed, and I only guessed it about maybe 3/4 of the way before Lauren Oliver revealed it, which is really good because normally I guess plot twists way before if they're foreshadowing it well and correctly. But anyway, it was super good. I really enjoyed it. The only thing was that I'll go ahead and warn you about is there was a ton of language. If you read the Delirium series, she kind of had like one like major curse word per character. That was like her limit. But in this one, it was completely different. I mean, if this were a movie, exactly word for word, it would be an R-rated movie with the amount of language that was in it. But it felt very appropriate for the tone of the book. So I really enjoyed it. Now, the next book I read, the third to last book, was Terrier by Tamora Pierce. This is the first book in the Becca Cooper series, and I gave this book 4 stars. Now, I've already read this book. It's a reread, or in this case, a read-listen, I guess you could call it. But essentially, this is about a girl named Becca Cooper who wants to become a dog, and dogs are like the police officers. But of course, in normal Tamora Pierce fashion, there is definitely a lot of magic involved, and Becca can actually talk to the spirits of the dead, and she can also talk to dust spinners, and that's how she gets a lot of her information. And oh, it's just so good. I love the whole thing. You guys know how much I love Tamora Pierce. She's one of my favorite authors of all times, and which is why this book helped me get out of my reading slump. And it also makes sense why the next book I read was Wild Magic, also by Tamora Pierce. Now, Tamora Pierce writes in 2 main worlds, and both of these books take place in the Tortall world. It's the first book of the Immortal series, and I gave it 5 stars. It was just simply amazing, simply fantastic. Again, this is another book that I've already read that I wanted to reread. And essentially this is about a girl named Diane who has the ability to talk to animals. She has what they call wild magic. And so she has to kind of learn to deal with that, and because people think that she's kind of weird, and she has to deal with Tortallian society, which is totally new to her because she came from kind of a different place, a different land. And I personally would suggest reading the Song of the Lioness series before this series because it makes it so much better. The first book in that series is Alana, but these 2 books connect really well. Alana happens, and then a couple years later, maybe like 10 years later, this book happens. So it's really good to read the Song of the Lioness series or quartet before Wild Magic. I think that that's the best option. But anyway, yes, I really enjoyed these 2 Tamora Pierce books, and I will talk more about her later. I'm hoping to do some kind of author sum up kind of review video for you guys a little bit later on. The last book I read in the first 3 months of this year was Operation Mincemeat, How a Dead Man and a Bizarre Plan Fooled the Nazis and Assured an Allied Victory by Ben McIntyre. Now, this is part of my attempt to read one nonfiction or classic book for every contemporary kind of book that I read this year. And let me tell you, I also listened to this book and it was fantastic. It was so interesting. As far as nonfiction books go, it was very well written. The facts were laid out. There wasn't any unnecessary fluff or unnecessary information like there was a lot in the previous book that I talked about, the previous nonfiction book I talked about. This is essentially about a plan during World War II called Operation Mincemeat, where they disguised a dead body as a Navy officer, and they kind of set him afloat off the shore of Spain with a briefcase full of fake information. Oh my gosh, it was just the most interesting thing. And the masterminds behind that include Ian Fleming, who wrote the James Bond novels. So that was kind of interesting to see him going into that. And then Ewan Montague was a big part of that. And then he wrote a book called The Man Who Never Was, or The Man Who Never Existed, or something like that. And that book was actually a fictionalized version of Operation Mincemeat. It's super interesting. I really enjoyed it. I thought that it was just a fascinating, very well written explanation of how the Allied powers used this dead man and a kind of crazy, super creative plan to fool the Nazis into thinking that they were not going to attack Sicily, but they were going to attack a couple of the surrounding areas. Anyway, it was just super fascinating. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And yes, it was just, it was amazing. I highly, highly recommend it. If you're interested in World War II history in general, if you're interested in espionage, or even just how writers can help in ways other than just writing fantastic books for us to read. Almost everyone involved in Operation Mincemeat was either an amateur writer who would later become a professional writer with lots of published books, or they were someone who, wrote for fun. Anyway, it was just really good. I loved it. 4 out of 5 stars. Highly recommend. So that is my quarterly wrap-up for January, February, and March of 2015. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you've read any books, let me know down below. Let me know what you guys have been reading and what you guys thought. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys later. Bye!